On the night of August 11th, 2026, U.S. Central Command confirmed it had completed its 11th consecutive night of strikes against Iran, and within hours, air raid activity was audible across multiple Iranian provinces at once, from explosions near Tehran itself to strikes reported on Qeshm Island, Bandar Abbas, and the southeastern port city of Chabahar. That's not a claim from a single source or a single government. That's a pattern independently reported by Al Jazeera, the semi-official Tasnim news agency, Iran Wire, and Turkey Today, all covering the same night from different angles. So today we're going to walk through exactly what happened that night, based on what's actually been confirmed by named outlets and named officials. And then we're going to go somewhere a lot of casual coverage of this war hasn't gone, into a genuinely significant, deeply reported story about what's actually been happening to America's own air defenses during this specific stretch of the conflict. A story built on Pentagon budget reports, a named U.S. official, and a direct quote from an Iranian military spokesperson. We're going to be careful throughout to separate what's officially confirmed from what's being reported through anonymous sources, because that distinction matters enormously here, and because the honest version of this story turns out to be more layered and, frankly, more important than a single dramatic night of footage can really capture on its own. If that's useful to you, stick around and go ahead and subscribe, because this is one of the more undercovered angles of this entire war. It's also worth being upfront, before we go any further, about where this material actually comes from. A mix of directly attributed news agency reporting on the strikes themselves, and a deeply sourced investigative piece built on named research institutions alongside officials speaking on background. Since a story spanning both a single confirmed night of fighting and a months-long structural trend genuinely requires both kinds of sourcing to tell, honestly. Let's start with what actually happened on the night of July 22nd itself, since that's the specific event this story centers on. According to Al Jazeera's coverage, explosions could be heard over Tehran as the U.S. military confirmed it had completed its 11th consecutive day of strikes on Iran, part of the broader campaign that had resumed after the ceasefire, reached earlier in the summer, collapsed in early July. Turkey Today is reporting on the same night, citing Iran's semi-official Tasnim news agency directly, stated that air defenses were activated in several districts across both eastern and western Tehran, following initial reports of explosions around Parchin and the nearby town of Pakdasht. It's worth being precise about what actually happened in Pakdasht specifically, because the record here is genuinely more nuanced than a simple story of a direct hit. According to Iran Wire's reporting, the Public Relations Office of the IRGC in Tehran province issued its own statement claiming the explosion sound heard in Pakdasht was actually caused by the operation of Iran's own air defense systems, firing near Parchin, not by an incoming strike itself, and the statement specifically denied any impact had occurred in the area, describing the activity as standard defensive operations. That's Iran's own official explanation for that specific sound, and it's worth including exactly as attributed, since it directly contradicts the assumption a lot of casual viewers might make that every loud explosion reported in Iranian coverage necessarily represents an American weapon actually landing. Elsewhere that same night, the picture was more clearly one of confirmed strikes rather than defensive fire. Iran Wire reported that Iran's state-run IRNA news agency described hearing the sound of an explosion on Qeshm Island, while officials in the Hormozgan governorate announced that a portion of the Sousa fish meal factory sustained limited damage during the strikes, adding that because the facility was vacant at the time, no casualties had been reported. In Sistan and Balochistan province, further explosions were reported in Chabahar, a region that had already been targeted in the days prior, with earlier reporting indicating a law enforcement command outpost there had been struck. Turkey Today's coverage added further detail from that same night, reporting explosions in Lorestan province in western Iran and in Semnan in the north, with Iran's Fars news agency quoting a provincial spokesperson who said parts of Semnan airport had been targeted, prompting a rescue response, though officials stressed no residential areas in the province had been hit. Separately, officials in Chabahar County, northwest of Hamadan City, reported an attack early that same Thursday morning, with Hamza Emrai, the Hamadan deputy governor for political, security, and social affairs, confirming no casualties while stating Iran's armed forces were monitoring the situation and prepared to respond to further escalation. It's worth noting that Iran's own retaliatory activity was documented from that same general period as well, which helps explain why tensions and defensive activity were running so high across multiple provinces simultaneously. Turkey Today's reporting noted that Iran claimed a separate drone attack on the U.S. Al-Azraq Air Base in Jordan around this time, saying communication systems, a fixed radar installation, and fuel depots had been hit, which Tehran described as retaliation for earlier American strikes, including one on the Bamper barracks in Iranshar that Iran said had killed 7 of its own soldiers. That same reporting traced the immediate cause of this specific flare-up, back to a dispute over how to actually implement the Pakistan-brokered Islamabad Memorandum of Understanding, particularly its provisions governing commercial shipping through the Strait of Hormuz, the same underlying disagreement that had already driven the broader ceasefire's collapse earlier that month. Now, here's where this story goes somewhere genuinely more significant than a single night's exchange of strikes, because in the days following that specific night, a much bigger and more carefully documented story broke about what's actually been happening to the American side of this air defense equation, and it deserves real attention. According to investigative reporting from The Intercept, published by reporter Nick Terse, and built on a named source structure worth walking through carefully, a U.S. official who spoke on condition of anonymity because they weren't authorized to speak with the press told the outlet that Iran has attacked at least 9 separate U.S. outposts across the Middle East since July 9th alone, with several of those bases suffering what the source specifically described as significant damage. It's important to be clear about the sourcing tier here. That specific figure comes from a single anonymous U.S. official speaking to one outlet, not from an official Pentagon statement, and CENTCOM's own media operations chief, Major Emma Thompson, was directly asked about the scale of these strikes and told The Intercept plainly, quote, "I have nothing for you on that." A direct, on-record non-denial that at minimum confirms the Pentagon wasn't disputing the underlying premise, even while declining to confirm specifics. The most consequential claim in that same reporting concerns the actual state of America's own missile defense stockpiles, and this part of the story is built on considerably stronger, more independently corroborated sourcing than a single anonymous quote. According to the same anonymous U.S. official, stocks of advanced air defense interceptor missiles, specifically the Patriot and THAAD systems that form the backbone of American missile defense in the region, have become so depleted that U.S. forces are no longer shooting down every Iranian missile and drone aimed at American and allied targets across the Middle East. The official told The Intercept that American forces are now making a deliberate choice to allow certain incoming projectiles through their defenses, specifically in cases where a strike is judged not to actually endanger American lives, essentially triaging which threats get engaged based on available interceptor supply, rather than engaging everything indiscriminately the way earlier in the conflict. That specific claim isn't standing alone on a single anonymous source, though, because the same reporting notes it directly references and corroborates an earlier report from NBC News that had already revealed this exact tactic independently. The broader munitions math behind that claim comes from named, publicly available defense policy research rather than anonymous sourcing at all, which makes it some of the most solid material in this entire story. According to a March analysis from the Royal United Services Institute, a well-established British defense think tank, the United States and its allies burned through more than 11,000 munitions, including large quantities of defensive interceptor missiles, in just the first 16 days of this war alone. That same RUSI report projected at the time that U.S. forces were roughly a month away from running out of THAAD interceptors entirely, if that pace of expenditure continued. A separate follow-up analysis published in April by the Center for Strategic and International Studies stated directly that, quote, "Diminished munitions stockpiles have created a near-term risk," and a further CSIS report the following month went even further, warning that it would take 3 or more years from that point forward to rebuild Patriot and THAAD interceptor inventories back to their pre-war levels. That's not speculation or an anonymous official's characterization. That's the conclusion of 2 separate, named, publicly published defense research reports from credible institutions, reaching essentially the same alarming conclusion about the sustainability of America's own missile defense posture during this specific conflict. On the Iranian side, there's an actual named on-record military statement that lines up with this same picture, which matters because it means this isn't purely an American-sourced story about American vulnerabilities. Brigadier General Hossein Mohebi, an Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps spokesperson, stated publicly, according to Iran's own IRNA news agency, that, quote, "Patriot systems have been weakened to such an extent that Iranian missiles and drones are reaching their targets without being intercepted." He specifically said that during a wave of attacks running from July 8th through July 22nd, the exact window that includes the night we opened this story with, Iran had struck numerous air defense and radar installations directly, including what he described as 6 separate Patriot air defense radar systems. It's worth being fair and precise here. That's Iran's own military spokesperson making a claim clearly designed to project strength and demoralize the American side. And CENTCOM did not respond to the Intercept's request for comment on Mohebi's specific claims. But the fact that an Iranian general's public boast and an anonymous American official's account of the exact same underlying dynamic, interceptor depletion, allowing more Iranian projectiles through, arrived at broadly the same conclusion from opposite sides of the conflict, is a genuinely notable point of convergence worth including honestly, rather than dismissing either account outright. The same interceptor strain shows up clearly in how the Pentagon has been asking Congress for money, which is another useful, independently verifiable thread running through this story, since defense budget requests are a matter of public record rather than anonymous sourcing. The Intercept's own earlier reporting, referenced directly within this later piece, documented that Secretary Hegseth had gone to Congress requesting additional funding, specifically as costs tied to the Iran war escalated sharply, a request that lines up logically with the RUSI and CSIS findings about munitions expenditure running far beyond what pre-war budget planning had anticipated. It's worth understanding why replacing a Patriot or THAAD interceptor isn't simply a matter of writing a bigger check either. These are genuinely complex, precision-guided systems that take specialized manufacturing capacity and time to produce at scale, which is exactly why CSIS's own analysis projected a multi-year timeline, not a matter of months, to rebuild American interceptor inventories back to where they stood before this war began, regardless of how much additional funding Congress ultimately approved. The NBC News reporting that the Intercepts piece explicitly corroborates deserves its own brief explanation too, because it was the outlet that first broke the specific tactic of deliberately allowing some incoming Iranian projectiles through American defenses. That NBC report, described in the Intercept's own piece as revealing this exact tactic, effectively meant two separate news organizations, working independently with their own separate sourcing, arrived at the same specific operational conclusion within a short span of each other, which is a meaningfully stronger form of corroboration than either single report would represent on its own. It's still worth being precise that both reports ultimately rely on U.S. officials speaking on background rather than an on-the-record Pentagon confirmation, since CENTCOM has consistently declined to discuss interceptor allocation decisions publicly, citing operational security. But two independently sourced reports reaching the same specific conclusion is a genuinely different, stronger category of evidence than a single anonymous claim standing alone. That deserves real care in how it's presented, because it involves named American service members who lost their lives. The Intercept's reporting connects a leaked video, which the outlet states is reportedly from Jordan's Muwafaq Salti Air Base, showing U.S. troops in a mix of combat fatigues and gym attire taking shelter in a bunker as warning sirens sounded during an attack, with a voice heard on the recording, described as likely a medic, warning fellow troops to stay off the walls because of the risk of traumatic brain injury from nearby blast waves. According to the reporting, 3 U.S. troops were killed during Iranian ballistic missile and drone attacks on that base on July 17th and 18th, and the Department of War's own casualty release identified them by name: Private Isabella Gonzalez, 19, of Carrollton, Texas, First Lieutenant Tyler James Feehan, 25, of Iwa Beach, Hawaii, and Sergeant Angel S. Rampersad, 28, of Ozone Park, New York. The Intercept reported, citing a different defense official speaking on background, that all 3 soldiers were from air defense units and were specifically not actively engaged in anti-aircraft activity at the moment of the attack, a detail that deserves to be included precisely as attributed, since it comes from a named type of source, a defense official, even though that individual wasn't publicly identified by name. Separately, an Iranian drone attack on Erbil Air Base in Iraq on July 18th led to the death of Army Sergeant Michael Emanuel Swinton, 30, of Fayetteville, North Carolina, during what CENTCOM itself publicly described, in its own official statement, as a controlled detonation of a downed enemy aircraft, language that suggests the fatal incident occurred during the process of safely destroying wreckage from an intercepted drone rather than from a direct hit. It's also worth including the broader casualty picture this reporting connects to, because it reflects a genuine documented dispute over how transparently the Pentagon has been reporting the human cost of this war. The Intercept's own earlier reporting, which this later piece directly references, found what multiple sources characterized as a significant undercount in the Pentagon's official casualty figures, with one U.S. government official going so far as to describe the situation to the outlet as a, quote, casualty cover-up. It's important to be precise about the strength of that specific claim. It comes from an anonymous government source characterizing the situation in strong language, not from an official government acknowledgement. And it represents one side of a genuine ongoing dispute about transparency, rather than an independently confirmed fact about deliberate concealment. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth told the Senate Armed Services Committee in April that CENTCOM had taken, in his words, every possible measure they could to ensure that our troops are protected, a direct, on-record statement that stands in tension with the casualty and interceptor depletion, a reporting that emerged in the months that followed, though it's worth noting Hegseth's statement and the later reporting aren't necessarily describing exactly the same claim. One addresses force protection measures broadly, while the other addresses interceptor stockpile levels specifically. The scale of what Iran has actually been firing during this conflict is also worth including with proper sourcing, because it helps explain why interceptor stockpiles came under this kind of pressure in the first place. According to the same anonymous U.S. official cited throughout the Intercept's reporting, Iran has fired between 8,000 and 9,000 drones and missiles at targets across the Middle East since the broader U.S.-Israeli war against Iran began back in February. That's an extraordinary volume of sustained fire over roughly 5 months, and it lines up logically with the RUSI and CSIS findings about munitions depletion, since even a highly capable, well-supplied missile defense network would face real strain trying to intercept a sustained barrage at that scale over that length of time. The reporting also documented a specific list of American and Allied military installations that Iran has claimed to have struck during this particular wave of fighting from July 8th through July 22nd, including Jordan's Prince Hassan Air Base, King Faisal Air Base, and Al Azraq Air Base, Kuwait's Al Adiri Base, Ahmed Al Jaber Air Base, Camp Doha, Ali Al Salem Air Base, and Camp Arifjan, Naval Support Activity Sheikh Issa in Bahrain, and Al Udeid Air Base in Qatar. It's worth being precise that this is Iran's own claimed target list, as compiled through Iranian and Iran-aligned reporting sources, and CENTCOM's spokesperson specifically declined to confirm or deny Iranian attacks on these various bases when asked directly, stating only that the command doesn't comment on battle damage assessments. It's worth taking a moment to explain, in plain terms, what these two specific interceptor systems actually do and why their depletion specifically would matter so much to the broader picture, since a general audience following this story deserves that context rather than just the acronyms. The Patriot system is a medium-range, ground-based air defense system, originally developed decades ago and continuously upgraded since, primarily designed to intercept aircraft, cruise missiles, and shorter-range ballistic missiles as they approach a defended target. THAAD, which stands for Terminal High Altitude Area Defense, is a more specialized, longer-range system specifically built to intercept ballistic missiles at a higher altitude, closer to the end of their flight path, giving defenders a second layer of protection if an incoming missile makes it past other defenses. Together, these two systems form much of the actual physical shield protecting American bases, allied nations, and civilian population centers across the Middle East from exactly the kind of ballistic missile and drone barrages Iran has been firing throughout this conflict. When outside researchers like RUSI and CSIS describe those specific stockpiles as depleted, they're describing a genuine gap in that physical shield, not just a budgeting inconvenience, which is precisely why the reported decision to let some incoming projectiles through untouched, rather than intercepting everything, represents such a consequential and risky operational choice for commanders to actually be making in real time. It's also worth including one additional documented incident from earlier in the war that the same reporting connects to this broader pattern of force protection gaps, because it shows this isn't a problem that emerged only recently. The Intercept's sourcing specifically referenced a March 1st drone attack on the U.S. base at Port Shuaiba in Kuwait that killed 6 American troops, which the anonymous U.S. official cited throughout this reporting attributed to a lack of sufficient overhead protection at that specific location, directly contradicting Secretary Hegseth's April testimony to the Senate Armed Services Committee that CENTCOM had taken every possible measure to protect American troops. That's a case where a specific named incident with a confirmed casualty count sits in direct documented tension with an on-record statement from the sitting defense secretary. And it's worth including precisely because it shows the interceptor and force protection concerns raised in the later July reporting weren't an isolated sudden development. They connect to a pattern of similar concerns being raised by sources close to the Pentagon going back to the earliest weeks of the war. A small American military outpost on Jordan's northern border with Syria, which the same U.S. official confirmed had come under renewed Iranian attack during this period, with satellite imagery and photos and videos circulating online indicating the base suffered extensive damage. Tower 22 carries particular historical weight in this exact context because it was the site of a drone attack by an Iran-backed militia back in 2024 that killed 3 American troops, meaning this represents the second time in a relatively short span that this specific, fairly obscure outpost has suffered fatal attacks connected to Iranian-aligned forces, a detail that adds real weight to how seriously American commanders would likely be treating any renewed threat to that same location. There's also a notable and genuinely significant international dimension to this reporting worth including carefully because it involves a claim about foreign assistance to Iran's military effort that goes beyond the immediate U.S.-Iran exchange. According to Reuters, cited directly in the Intercept's reporting, Iran struck CIA facilities in Iraq, Saudi Arabia, and elsewhere in the region, with questions raised about a possible Russian role in supporting those specific strikes. A former Pentagon consultant with ties to the defense industry told The Intercept that Russia has, in the source's words, certainly provided targeting support to Iran during this conflict, though that same source did not comment directly on the specific CIA facility strikes. It's worth including the official American position on this question directly and precisely, because there's a real documented tension within the administration's own public statements on it. President Trump has stated publicly, through a Truth Social post, that Russia and China are, in his words, not participating in the Iran war. Defense Secretary Hegseth, testifying before Congress, offered a notably different characterization, stating that both Russia and China are, in his words, enabling some of the things Iran is doing. Separately, CIA Director John Ratcliffe told senators back in March that, according to his own intelligence, Iranians are requesting intelligence assistance from Russia, from China, and from other adversaries of the United States, while specifically declining to detail in an open hearing what assistance, if any, had actually been provided, saying he would only discuss that in a classified setting. That's a genuine documented gap between the president's own public framing and his own defense secretaries and CIA directors' more measured, on-record congressional testimony, and it's worth presenting exactly as that gap, rather than resolving it in either direction, since neither official has publicly clarified the apparent contradiction. It's also worth noting how this specific period of intensified strikes and interceptor strain actually connects back to broader developments in the war that followed shortly after. According to the Intercept's reporting, Allied nations including Israel, Saudi Arabia, Jordan, Iraq, and Qatar all reported intercepting attack drones just 2 days after the United States abruptly suspended a 2-week campaign of airstrikes against Iran. A pause the reporting attributes specifically to concern over dwindling stocks of air defense missiles, combined with what officials described as a reported dearth of remaining Iranian targets worth striking. President Trump insisted publicly around that same time that there had been what he called very good talks with Iran, though he did not offer supporting evidence when reporters pressed him on the claim, and Iranian officials publicly denied that characterization. Saudi Arabia's foreign ministry stated that the drone attacks its own territory suffered around that time were carried out by Iran-backed militias operating in Iraq, rather than by Iran directly, while Jordanian authorities separately confirmed downing a drone in the eastern part of the country near its border with Iraq and Saudi Arabia. That specific sequence, an American pause in offensive strikes attributed to interceptor shortages, followed almost immediately by a fresh wave of drone activity against multiple allied nations, is worth sitting with, because it suggests the strain on American and allied missile defense capacity wasn't a brief, isolated dip. It appears to have directly shaped real operational decisions about when and whether to continue the broader air campaign. There's also a broader pattern worth including about how this specific strain has rippled outward to America's regional allies, not just to U.S. forces directly, because it helps explain why the interceptor shortage matters well beyond a single country's own defense posture. The same period that saw allied nations including Israel, Saudi Arabia, Jordan, Iraq, and Qatar all reporting intercepted drone attacks reflects a defense architecture across the entire region that has, to varying degrees, relied on American-supplied interceptor systems and American command and control coordination throughout this conflict. When the supplier of that shared defensive umbrella is itself reporting depleted stockpiles, the effect isn't contained neatly within U.S. military installations alone. It logically extends to every allied nation whose own air defense planning has assumed a certain level of American backup and resupply capacity remaining available throughout the conflict, which is part of why outside researchers like RUSI have framed the interceptor question as a regional strategic risk rather than a narrower American logistics problem. Let's also be fair about the broader casualty transparency dispute this story connects to, because it deserves to be presented with its full context rather than reduced to a single dramatic label. The Intercept's characterization of a casualty cover-up rests on the account of one anonymous government official, and it represents a serious, contested allegation rather than an independently confirmed fact about deliberate Pentagon concealment. At the same time, the underlying pattern the reporting describes, official casualty figures that multiple separate sources say run meaningfully lower than the actual toll, is the kind of claim that becomes more credible the more independently it gets corroborated across separate reporting over time, and this specific outlet has published several separate pieces over multiple months, making a version of that same core argument using different sourcing each time. That pattern of repeated, independently sourced reporting reaching a similar conclusion is worth weighing seriously, even while stopping short of treating the most severe characterization, an intentional cover-up, as a settled fact, rather than one interpretation of a genuinely disputed situation. Because there are really two separate but connected stories running through everything we've just covered. The first is the specific multi-province night of July 22nd itself, well documented through independent reporting from outlets covering both the American strikes and Iran's own defensive and retaliatory activity, including Iran's own careful public clarification that at least one loud explosion that night came from its own air defenses firing rather than from an actual American weapon landing. The second, considerably larger story is what that single night was actually a symptom of: a documented months-long strain on America's own missile defense stockpiles, serious enough that credible, named defense research institutions were independently warning about a multi-year rebuilding timeline, serious enough that a U.S. official was willing to describe a deliberate policy of letting some incoming threats through rather than intercepting everything, and serious enough that it appears to have directly factored into an actual, if temporary, pause in the American offensive air campaign. That second story is the one that arguably deserves far more public attention than it's actually received, because it's not built on speculation or a single dramatic headline. It's built on named research institutions, a Pentagon spokesperson's own on-record non-denial, and a rare moment of rough agreement between an anonymous American official and a named Iranian general describing the same underlying dynamic from opposite sides of the fight. It's worth being honest about the remaining uncertainty here, too, the same way any fair account of a story built partly on anonymous sourcing has to be. The specific figures for how many bases have been hit, how much damage each one sustained, and exactly how depleted American interceptor stocks currently are, remain genuinely difficult to verify with full precision because CENTCOM has consistently declined to confirm operational specifics, citing standard battle damage assessment policy. What is independently verifiable through named research institutions rather than anonymous sourcing alone is the basic trajectory: an extraordinary rate of munitions expenditure early in the war, credible warnings from defense analysts about a multi-year recovery timeline for key interceptor systems, and named American service members who lost their lives at bases. The reporting connects directly to this broader strain. That combination of solidly sourced structural facts and more uncertain specific figures is exactly the kind of nuance worth carrying into how you think about this story, rather than treating either the most alarming anonymous claim or the most dismissive official non-denial as the complete picture on its own. So here's what I'd genuinely like to know from you. Given everything we just walked through, the well-documented multi-province night of strikes and Iranian air defense activity on July the 22nd, alongside the far less publicly discussed story of American interceptor stockpiles running low enough to change actual battlefield tactics, do you think the second story deserves significantly more public attention than it's gotten? Or do you think the anonymous sourcing behind some of these specific claims means it's fair for outlets and officials to remain cautious about how much weight to put on it? Given that two separate news organizations, working with separate sourcing, independently reached the same conclusion about interceptors being deliberately allowed through, does that level of corroboration change how much weight you'd personally put on a story that still ultimately rests on officials speaking anonymously rather than a formal Pentagon confirmation? And given the real, documented gap between President Trump's public claim that Russia and China aren't participating in this war, and his own defense secretaries and CIA directors' more cautious on-record testimony suggesting otherwise, which account do you find more convincing, and why? Let me know what you think in the comments, because that's genuinely where a lot of what we dig into next comes from. If untangling a story this layered, with sourcing clearly attributed at every step instead of just repeating whichever version sounded the most dramatic, was useful to you, go ahead and share it with someone who's been trying to actually understand what's happening in this conflict beyond the headlines. Tap the like button so more people see a version of this story that's actually grounded in named research and on-record statements, and subscribe if you want to keep following how this war continues to develop. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.